Dearly beloved, how's it going? Welcome to D&D Optimized, part of the D4 network, the show where each week we take a deep dive into one, sometimes two specific character builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and we do our best to theorycraft about them, number crunch, and essentially create a character that is both powerful and really fun to play in-game. If you enjoy creating characters for D&D almost as much as you enjoy playing the actual game, then welcome home. This is where you belong, and we are super happy to have you. My name's Colby, and I'll be your host, so thanks for being here. Really quick, before we get started, if you enjoy the content, I do hope you'll like and subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and even consider joining as a member. I don't offer a lot for memberships, but for a couple of bucks a month, right now anyway, you do get a little cheat sheet to the builds that I do that can hopefully potentially help you if you wanted to kind of recreate the character yourself and or follow along while you watch the video. But mostly it's just a way to support us here and hopefully help me create more and better content. So anyway, I also wanted to plug our Tales of Veneria, our actual play, live play session that we've been recording and posting. If you haven't seen it yet, I feel like it just keeps getting better and better. This last episode, episode 4, is my favorite so far. And for those who were a little bit put off by some sound issues that we were having in earlier episodes, now would be a great time to jump in. We've done a lot to improve them, and I think episode 5 is actually even better yet when it comes to sound quality especially. So anyway, we do a great little recap at the beginning of each episode, so if you wanted to just watch the recap and then jump in like at episode 4, for example, I think it would be a great place to start, and you could not feel like you missed out on too much. Although there's some great stuff that happens in those earlier episodes too that you miss from the recap. But anyway, little plug there. Check it. Let's jump in. With one exception, the only wizard builds that I have done thus far in the 43 episodes or so that we've done have all been melee builds. The Blade Singer, the Wizard Tank, etc., right? The only exception so far to that has been the Chronergy Wizard that I did as part of the Druid Wizard team-up build. Here we go, card number 1. I mean, I guess melee must be my preferred playstyle, right? I think I have a little bit of a bias there, but I feel like making a good old-fashioned blaster spellslinger type character is definitely a gap in my repertoire that needs to be addressed. Now, admittedly, I actually have quite a fondness for this character type. You wouldn't think so, I guess, based on my episodes thus far. But really, the first character that I ever made and played and loved in D&D way back during advanced Dungeons & Dragons days, in my formative years, was a character named Magus. I took him all the way to 20th level. And he was just a good old-fashioned spellslinger. I loved throwing fireballs and chain lightning. And it's still awesome and a fun playstyle, I think, and potentially, depending on the situation, incredibly useful and powerful, I would argue. Now, when we're talking about spellslingers, unless you're optimizing for cantrip damage, which I have done a couple of times, the Eldritch Sorcerer, Sorlock build, the Magic Touch, the Sorcerer with the Magic Touch, right? But outside of optimizing for cantrip damage, you're basically talking Nova or Burst damage, right? Because casters, as a rule, have a limited number of spell slots, and aside from Warlocks anyway, who only get very few spell slots, right? Your spell slots don't reset until a long rest. There are a few options for some classes for, recovering spell slots, but basically speaking, once they're gone, they're gone until a long rest. So if you're using a lot of spell slots for damage, you're kind of by default talking about a burst or Nova damage build, I think. And so all of these reasons, wanting to create a spellslinger, realizing that sort of meant that I was going for a Nova damage build, are what made me feel like I had to do last week's episode. I'm going to run out of cards really quick. On Nova damage spells, right? Burst damage spells, to sort of lay the groundwork, as it were. With that complete, I feel much better able to do a couple of builds on burst damage. One for area of effect, multiple target burst damage, and one for single target. Today, we're going to be focusing on the multiple target area of effect burst damage character, and I think next week I'll do the single target. I might give us a break from burst damage spells. We'll see. But anyway, now some of you may be asking, should we actually be spending lots of spell slots for like big area of effect burst damage type spells? Wouldn't our party be better off using, those higher level spell slots for control, buffing, debuffing, etc. that those really powerful spells can potentially really excel at? The answer, of course, I think, like everything pretty much in D&D, is it depends. First and foremost, in my opinion, it depends on what you want to do with your character and what you think is a lot of fun. If blasting away at enemies sounds like a lot of fun and is how you want to play your character, well, then yes, in my opinion, that is what you should do with your character, right? But of course, speaking from a strategic and sort of optimization perspective, it will depend on a lot of things, right? How many spell slots do you have? What kind of characters are your friends playing? And mostly what you're fighting and at what level. If you're up against a big bad single enemy, of course not. If you're up against lots of enemies but with a high likelihood of resisting your damage type or making their saving throw, probably don't want to be throwing out lots of area of effect damage spells. Probably be better off using a control or a debuff type spell, etc. But if you can potentially take out or really soften up a number of enemies with some big sort of nova blasting, then I say go for it. But of course, if you're going for area of effect damage or AoE, right, there is one big potential concern: friendly fire. There are a lot of fun, big damage, big area, multiple target spells in the game, as we discussed last week. But most of them are going to hurt both your friends and your allies. It will hurt whoever is in the area of effect, meaning that you will often either have to say, sorry everybody, I feel bad, I hope you don't die, which sucks, or you'll have to cast the area of effect of the spell in a way such that it sort of keeps your friends safe but maybe doesn't quite hit as many enemies as you would like to. Unless you are an evoker. It's not super fancy. It's not super complicated. It's just straight up massive area of effect burst damage goodness. Let's jump in to episode 44, the Evocation Wizard. And at level 1, our starting class is a fighter. Can this guy never do a build without multiclassing? I mean, I could, but why? It's so fun to multiclass. Admittedly, I actually have a hard time multiclassing, hard though that may be to believe, when I'm going for like a wizard especially, or any class that focuses on spells primarily for their damage, because it's really hard to justify delaying those higher level spells. The truth is, though, we do get a lot out of fighter. Constitution saving throw proficiency is nice for our concentration checks, among other things. Heavy armor and medium armor for that matter, and shield proficiency is great for our survivability. But, again, we're mostly here for the better burst damage we're going to get out of it. Now, if you are a little less interested in like big Nova round area of effect damage and more interested in doing all of the other cool things that wizards and higher level spells can also do for you and your party while still doing some good damage, right? Then I would just say skip the fighter levels and go straight wizard all the way. When have I ever done anything in the name of being well balanced? Almost never. So yeah, I mean, caution, right? We're going for big burst damage. We're going for fighter. Race. We want to go custom lineage, I think, because it's going to give us +2 to a stat of our choice. It's going to give us dark vision and a very important for us, free feat. And that free feat that we're going to pick up will be telekinetic. So telekinetic is great. It gives us a +1 to our intelligence, among other things, which is going to be really great, or wisdom or charisma, but we'll choose intelligence, of course. As a character who is sort of primarily concerned with area of effect spells, it's going to be really important for us to get as many enemies in our area of effect as possible. And being able to shove one enemy 5 feet either away from you or towards you that we get from this telekinetic feat will often be the difference between getting, one more enemy into our area of effect spell. As a bonus action, now we will be able to try and shove a creature 5 feet away from us or towards us. They get to make a strength saving throw against our intelligence difficulty check, our spell DC essentially. And yeah, that's going to be really great. You're going to want to get creative here sometimes, especially if you're casting a spell, for example, that's like a cone, right? You might need to sort of move, pull somebody into range, kind of move back, and then cast your spell. It'll be super useful, and you can also use it, of course, on an ally. They can willingly fail their saving throw, and you can just shove them, maybe to get them potentially out of the way of an enemy that they don't want to be in melee range of, for example, to keep them safe. And they wouldn't even take an opportunity attack if you did that, because we're told you don't provoke an opportunity attack when you teleport or when someone or something moves you without using your movement, action, or reaction, right? So they would be safe. You can use it defensively yourself too, of course. If an enemy gets up in your business and you don't want them there, you can kind of shove them away and then, move and cast your spells, etc. So it'll be super handy, super useful. You also, with telekinetic, get Mage Hand, the Mage Hand cantrip, which is nice, and you can actually even cast it without verbal or somatic components and make it invisible. So that could come in handy in certain situations, right? As far as abilities go, we're going to start assuming point by, as always, with a 15 intelligence. You'll take your +2 from your racial there, +1 from telekinetic, so we're starting with an 18 intelligence, which is really nice. And then a 14 constitution, a 14 dexterity, and a 12 wisdom. We are a little vulnerable to wisdom saving throws here, I realize. I'll probably try to address that later. But definitely a potential weakness to the build. And, as an aside, for the record, I'm totally okay with weaknesses in builds, right? Obviously. I like to go glass cannon, high risk, high reward type characters, as you can probably tell. Of course, I don't always necessarily anticipate that you will, take the same route. And so, of course, you can always tweak things as you go to, in the name of being more well-balanced. But anyway, I just think it keeps it interesting to have some potential vulnerabilities, personally. As far as equipment goes, pretty standard stuff. You can just grab some scale mail, a shield, and a rapier is probably what I would do. With a low strength score and a +2 to our dexterity, we're going to be using medium armor over heavy, so as not to have the movement penalty. Right now, scale mail +2 dexterity is as good as chain mail, although later plate mail outpaces half plate, right? Heavy armor eventually will be better for your AC than even the best medium armor +2 dex, but maybe later on, if plate mail becomes available, you might want to consider taking it if you feel like you're rarely in melee range and your movement isn't, as important for you. Or of course, if some mithril armor comes up and nobody else really wants it, then go for it. Right now, our armor class is an 18, which is pretty good for someone who's mostly going to be a wizard. Fighting style. We get a fighting style. I would probably take the defense fighting style. It gives us a +1 to our armor class if you're wearing armor. Of course, other options could be interesting. Interception could give you a nice little support feature to help out your allies if they're going to be standing close to you. I don't anticipate that will happen a lot because I think we're mostly going to be in range for our character's career. Superior technique could actually be really handy as long as obviously you didn't take a maneuver that requires a weapon attack. So if you took something like bait and switch or ambush or parry or rally, etc., that could be great too. You know me, I like numbers and reliability. So right now a 19 armor class feels really, really good. And then of course at Fighter 1, we also get Second Wind, which is just a nice little heal. As a bonus action, you can heal yourself for 1d10 plus your fighter level, and you can use that once per short rest. It doesn't scale particularly well, especially for us, because we're not taking a ton of fighter levels, but it's pretty good, especially early on, for a nice little heal. At level 2, fighters get Action Surge, and that's the main reason that we're here. You know, if you want to be a burst damage or Nova damage type character, it almost feels impossible not to take fighter levels. Though I have done it once. Right there, check it out. I might be out of cards. Whoosh. And not surprisingly, this holds true even if you want to be a spell caster. In fact, it almost feels, I think, more important to take 2 levels of fighter if you want to be a Nova or burst damage focused spellcaster, because the easiest and most reliable way to cast 2 non-cantrip spells with a casting time of 1 action on your turn is via Action Surge. I think it's impossible to do otherwise. Some of you are going to argue against that, and that's fine. We can have that debate in the comments if you want to. I mean, Quicken Spell, obviously, from a sorcerer will let us, cast a spell that has a casting time of an action as a bonus action, but then, because of the way that the rules are written, on your turn, as your action, you could only use a cantrip spell. So if you want to throw 2 fireballs on your turn, and we do, this is the way to go. At level 3, you are a wizard level 1. So something has happened in our character's life that makes us want to delve into the arcane arts. Perhaps another character in your party that you're close to, that's a caster, has offered to teach you. Perhaps you fought an enemy spellcaster and realized that the power that they wielded was so much more intriguing and potent than what you were able to accomplish with your rapier. Maybe you've even been noticed by a local Arcanists guild, right? Who appreciate your high intellect. Or you were given a quest by an archmage who seeks to equip you with greater power to better and more easily accomplish the task that they have assigned to you. I would suggest spending some time thinking about this, talking it over with your DM. But we are going wizard here, and we are not looking back. So, as a wizard level 1, we get Arcane Recovery. Once per day, when you finish a short rest, you can recover some spell slots equal to half your wizard level, rounded up, so that's 1 currently, 1 spell slot. Later we'll be able to mix and match these if we want, so at level 5 wizard, for example, we could do either 1 level 3 spell slot, or 1 level 2 spell slot and 1 level 1 spell slot, or 3 level 1 spell slots, right? Quite handy. None of the spell slots that we recover can be greater than 5th level, unfortunately, no matter how many wizard levels we have, unless you find a magic item that says otherwise. Or your DM decides to let you, I suppose. Anyway, we do get spells here, and there are a lot of good ones. There are always a lot of good ones at every spell level. We are a wizard, after all. You are a wizard, Harry. Right. Shield and absorb elements are fantastic for defensive purposes. So there's some great rituals like Find Familiar, of course, or Detect Magic. Sleep is a good control spell at low levels. The ones that I want to make sure that we pick up are for single target damage, and the one that we'll probably be using when we want to conserve spell slots or we're out of spell slots is Toll the Dead. That's a wisdom saving throw, or they take a d12 of damage, assuming they're missing some hit points, a d8 otherwise, right? It's good for single target damage as far as cantrips go anyway. The other cantrip, Thunderwave is nice. It's just a d6 within 5 feet of us, so it's kind of our best area of effect damage cantrip. Sword Burst, you could argue, would be better because it's a dexterity save. Thunderwave's a constitution save, but Thunderwave is an evocation spell, and Sword Burst is not, and that's going to be important for us later. So anyway, and then make sure you grab Burning Hands as a first level spell. It's going to be our best area of effect damage spell here early on. It does 3d6 of damage in a 15-foot cone from you. Fire damage, that is, pending a dexterity saving throw. And that's pretty nice for a first level spell, and it scales by 1d6 for every spell level that you upcast it. At level 4, we are a wizard 2, and we get our Arcane Tradition. our subclass. And of course, we're going with the School of Evocation. You focus your study on magic that creates powerful elemental effects such as bitter cold, searing flame, rolling thunder, crackling lightning, and burning acid. Some evokers find employment in military forces, serving as artillery to blast enemy armies from afar. Others use their spectacular power to protect the weak, while some seek their own gain as bandits, adventurers, or aspiring tyrants. You are the Blaster's Blaster. So we get Evocation Savant at this level, which just tells us that evocation spells cost you half the time and gold to copy into your spellbook, so be on the lookout for evocation spell scrolls or another mage's spellbook for that matter. And then we get the all-important Sculpt spells. If you cast an evocation spell that would potentially affect other targets that you can see, you can cause 1 plus the spell's level number of allies, essentially, and have them automatically make their saving throw against the spell and then take no damage for making their save if they would normally take half. So basically, it's just a way to keep your allies totally safe from the area of effect spells that you cast. It's glorious. For the most part, we're not really too worried about hitting our friends with our area of effect spells and can place things perfectly so that they can hit as many enemies as possible. It's difficult to be more effective than an evoker when it comes to a character focused on area of effect damage. Spells that are affected by this include Thunderwave and Burning Hands. Keep in mind that as a cantrip, Thunderwave would only protect one ally because it's 1 plus the spell's level, and the spell's level of a cantrip is 0, right? So you still might need to think a little bit about it before casting to make sure that you don't hit your friends. But Burning Hands would protect 2 allies from getting hit, and with a fairly small radius of a 15-foot cone, right? That should be all you need to cast it wherever you want for maximum effect. At level 5, we are a Wizard 3, and we get 2nd level spells. There's too many good ones and useful ones to name here, as there will always be, but, Misty Step, Flaming Sphere, Levitate, Hold Person, Crown of Madness, all fantastic and more, right? The 2 I will focus on are good AoE options. AoE, area of effect, yes. Dragon's Breath. Dragon's Breath does comparable damage to Burning Hands. It would be 3d6 instead of 4d6. Burning Hands, if you cast it at a 2nd level spell, right, would be 4d6. So 3.5 damage on average per target. But it has a really great benefit of being a concentration spell that you can just use every turn without spending additional spell slots. It also has the added benefit of letting you choose the damage type, so it could be fire or cold or lightning or acid or poison. You can tailor it to your enemies in that way and avoid any resistances that they may have. Since we only have a couple of 2nd level spell slots at the moment, it's a pretty efficient use of one of them. But do keep in mind that unlike Burning Hands, it is not an evocation spell, it's transmutation, so you will have to be careful if you're using Dragon's Breath not to hit your friends. Fortunately, you could move one of them with telekinesis as a bonus action before, using Dragon's Breath, and so, you could still do a pretty decent job of lining it up and keeping your friends safe while hurting as many enemies as possible. We also could get Shatter here. As I mentioned last week, it's a 3d8 instead of Burning Hands 4d6 here, which is only a difference on average of 0.5 damage, so it's almost exactly the same. Shatter is a Constitution save as opposed to a Dexterity save, and generally that's going to be worse for us. Enemies tend to have a better con save than a Dex save in D&D, although at low levels it's less pronounced. But also, Shatter has a better range, arguably. Definitely a better range. You can cast it, from far away, but then also it's a 10-foot radius circle or a 20 by 20 grid on if you're using a grid, rather than a 15-foot cone. So use whichever one is going to let you hit the most enemies and or take advantage of the lower save, if that's something your character would know about. I'm not trying to encourage metagaming. At level 6, we're a Wizard 4, and we get our first ability score increase or feat, and I'm going to bump my intelligence. And that means we're capped with a 20 intelligence at level 6, which feels awesome. Our enemies are going to have a really hard time resisting our difficulty check at this level. It's a 16, which is quite good for a level 6 character. And we'll even be able to prepare more spells as a result, among other things. So, be really great. Time for our first damage report. So typically when I do a damage report, I will do, I'll give you two numbers, one for a like if everything hit equivalent almost, right, at a 10 armor class, and then kind of a maybe more typical armor class that you might expect to be up against at the level that I'm reporting on. Whenever I've had saving throws, I've kind of just mirrored that, but done like a +0 to save, and like at 6, a +5 to save, for example, so that I could kind of mirror the 10 armor class and 15 armor class that I do for level 6, right? That said, all of the damage that we're going to be doing is going to be saving throw based. And if you look, at least in the monster manual, at challenge rating 6 monsters, the average saving throw is not +5, right? Their dexterity saving throw, which they're going to be using to save against most of our spells anyway, on average for a CR 6 is just a +2. When I'm doing damage reports for this build, I'm going to do like a +0 to save, and then a plus whatever the average for the monster CR of the level that we're reporting on is, if that makes sense. I think you're a lot more likely, in fact, you're more likely to fight a monster with a +0 to their dex save than you are a +5 to their dex save when we're looking at CR6 monsters. I appreciate that we're going to be fighting challenge ratings of all varieties, and sometimes you'll fight monsters with a higher challenge rating, sometimes lower, etc. You guys can do the math and make adjustments in your head to figure out. This is just a good way to kind of give us a baseline as to what sort of numbers we might be able to expect based on our level and the monsters that we're probably going to be fighting, right? I'm also going to assume that we are hitting 3 targets with our area of effect spells. I appreciate that won't always be the case, especially pre-fireball. Sometimes you won't even be fighting, 3 monsters in an encounter. Sometimes they'll be too spread out. Of course, other times you'll be hitting even more, especially when we get higher level. Again, you guys can make those mental adjustments. I'm not too worried about it. But I think especially with our ability to kind of nudge an enemy with telekinesis before we cast, 3 isn't super unreasonable. So at this level, for our burst round, our Nova round, we'll simply be running in, nudging a bad guy into the area of effect if need be, and throwing out Burning Hands as a 2nd level spell, then using Action Surge and doing it again. And assuming that we hit 3 targets with the spells against an enemy with a +0 to their saving throw, we would be doing 73 damage total. And against enemies with a +2 to their saving throw, it would be 69 damage total. That's pretty nice. Using Shatter gives us ever so slightly lower numbers, but either way, it beats out all other burst damage builds that I've done for total damage at this level, other than the Needler. Of course, we're not really making apples to apples comparisons here, right? If you're only hitting 2 targets, it'll be 2/3 of those numbers I just mentioned. The damage is spread against multiple enemies and not just one, which sometimes will be exactly what you want, and other times not so much, right? But still, good numbers, feeling strong. At level 7, we are a Wizard 5, and we get 3rd level spells. The moment we've all been waiting for. Of course, there are a million great spells to choose from here. Counterspell, Dispel Magic. We'll probably want Erupting Earth eventually. Fly, Haste, Tiny Hut. Definitely get this little ritual gem. Summon Fae is good, but we are going to focus on the heavy-hitting area of effect spells. So Fireball and Lightning Bolt, first of all. Both are evocation spells, and as such, cast at the 3rd level would let you exempt up to 4 allies from their effects, which should be most, if not all, of your party. Both do 8d6 of damage, pending a dexterity save. One does fire damage in a 20-foot radius sphere, right? So basically a 8x8 on the grid. And the lightning bolt does, lightning damage, of course, in a 100-foot line, 5 feet wide is all. So most of the time, fireball is going to be easier to hit more enemies with, but you might want to have lightning bolt in your pocket, just in case enemies are lined up perfectly and or are resistant to fire damage, which is a more commonly resisted damage type than lightning. There's not a lot to say about these other than they are quintessential blaster wizard spells. In my book, they never get old to use. However, there is one other spell that I'd like to mention here that I think we should be making use of, and it is Melf's Minute Meteors. It's an evocation spell as well. It requires your concentration. It lasts 10 minutes, and it creates 6 tiny meteors that sort of orbit in your space. Then when you cast it, and as a bonus action, on subsequent turns, you can shoot 1 or 2 of the meteors to a point within 120 feet, where they explode, forcing every creature within 5 feet of where it exploded to make a dexterity save or take 2d6 fire damage per meteor, so potentially 4d6 if you shoot 2 of them. Now, that's not a huge area of effect, I appreciate that, but it's, I think, totally reasonable to include it in our burst round going forward, maybe assuming it will hit 2 targets. I mean, it's a 3x3, right? If you cast it into the middle of like a 3x3 on the grid, it could hit everybody in that little area, right? So I think 2 targets, assuming we could hit 2 there, is fairly conservative. Obviously, sometimes you'll hit more, sometimes you'll hit less. But one thing to note, upcasting it does not increase the damage, just the number of meteors by 2 per spell level. So super fun and super flavorful. At level 8, we are a wizard 6, and we get an evocation feature called Potent Cantrip. This is actually pretty nice. So when a creature succeeds on a save against our cantrips, like Toll the Dead, for example, they will still take half damage, but suffer no additional effect. One of the worst things about cantrips is that if the enemy makes their save, they don't take any damage, right? And so now they're at least doing half like they do with our spell slots, most of our spell slot spells anyway. The reality is that we are planning on burning 2 of our highest level spell slots in our burst round, and now, at this point, we would still have 8 spell slots left for casting after that Nova round. But assuming you want to be conservative or that you've run out of spell slots, you could be tolling the dead on an enemy for okay single target damage per round. I mean, better anyway if they're taking half when they make their saving throw, for no resource expenditure, right? I actually almost took a single level in Death Cleric here, so that I could potentially toll the dead on 2 enemies, because Death Clerics get that ability when they use a necromancy cantrip. They have to be standing next to each other, but that's feasible, especially with telekinesis, to kind of move enemies around and line that up. I ultimately decided not to delay my higher spell slot progression any more than I already have. But if you wanted to do that, though, I'd say go for it. And I would probably do it at the next level now that we have this feature and 3rd level spells, right? But of course, that's not what we're doing, because we want to be a Wizard 7 at level 9 and get access to 4th level spells. So, I mean, Polymorph, Dimension Door, Greater Invisibility, so many good ones. I'm just going to talk about a couple. Blight is great for single target burst damage, which isn't the focus of this character, of course, but sometimes you'll just have one big bad to fight, and it's nice to have something in your pocket that's going to be relatively hard-hitting. It is, of course, a Constitution save, Blight, for 8d8 damage instead of what would be, 9d6 for Fireball or Lightning Bolt. It's not a ton more damage than Fireball or Lightning Bolt, so depending on the enemy save, you might actually just be better off using one of those. But there are some other good options. Ice Storm and Storm Sphere, I think, are nice evocation spell options. Less damage, added control, and in the case of Storm Spear, even less AoE damage, but then it has a little, concentration once per turn effect where you get to do some additional damage to a single target. So anyway, those are worth considering, I think. As for a damage report at 9th level, so for the numbers here, I'm going to assume that you are taking round 1 to cast Melf's Minute Meteors. throwing out one or two of them to get some initial damage, and then on round 2, unloading with 2 fireballs or lightning bolts, I guess, one at the 4th level, one at the 3rd level, hitting 3 targets with each of them, and then as a bonus action, hitting 2 more enemies with 2 tiny meteors for 4d6 each. Now, of course, there will be times when you don't want to wait until round 2 to launch your artillery barrage, right? Because the enemies start the fight nicely bunched up for you. And or you want to take some out right at the beginning so they don't get a turn in round 1, right? If that's the case, sure, unload on round 1. Do meteors later if you want. On the other hand, there will be times that the enemies are starting the fight a little more spread out and waiting around for your barbarian to kind of charge in, and then all the bad guys swarm up on them. Will make it much more effective for you to wait until then and unload and hit one. Also, of course, you might not want to blow so many high-level spell slots, all in the name of big AoE burst damage. It might be overkill. You might not have the spell slots to burn, or you might want to conserve them for other purposes. That's fine. One fireball and a few meteors might be all you need. As always, we're simply exploring what's possible, and recognizing that doing everything that's possible might not always be, the best path to take. By the way, the average dexterity save for a CR9 monster in the monster manual is still just a +2. Also, as always, of course, I am putting all the numbers in the video description. There's a graph, a spreadsheet that will show you all the way from a +0 to save all the way to a +15 to save. But for us, here, reporting against an enemy with a +0 to their saving throw, doing all of the above that I mentioned, on average you would be doing 185 total damage. And against enemies with a +2 to their dexterity saving throw, you would be doing 175 total damage. Way ahead of the other Nova damage builds that I've done for total damage. Of course, we're spread out amongst multiple enemies, but still. That's a lot of damage, and it feels really powerful and cool and fun and awesome. At level 10, we are a Wizard 8, and we get another ability score increase or feat. 2 options here, I think. If you're worried about enemies resisting your fire spells, because that is mostly what we're casting thus far, I'd probably go with Elemental Adept. With this feat, you choose an elemental damage type, so Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, Thunder. And after that, spells of that damage type that you cast ignore enemy resistance to it. Now, it doesn't override enemy immunity, and it doesn't ignore enemies' general magic resistance feature that they sometimes have that will give some enemies advantage on saving throws against spells. But if you are running into a lot of fire-resistant enemies, it would be really nice to have. Otherwise, I'm probably taking Resilient Wisdom here to let me be proficient in wisdom saving throws so that I can do a better job resisting enemy spellcasters who are trying to shut me down, charm me, etc. At level 11, we are a Wizard 9, and we get 5th level spell slots. So many good ones. You should probably take Animate Objects, even though it makes me mad because it's overpowered. And you'd be crazy not to take Wall of Force because it's such an amazing control spell. Then there's Cone of Cold, which I talked about last week. It does slightly more damage as a 5th level spell than Fireball or Lightning Bolt, just based on numbers alone, but it is a con save instead of dex. So, depending on the enemy that you're fighting, if you think they have resistance to fire and lightning but not cold, and or you're not too worried about the con save, go for it. It's going to get you a little more mileage for your area, though it is a cone, but it's a 60-foot cone, so it's a pretty big area. The one that I really want to focus on here, though, is Dawn. So this is our new go-to concentration spell for area of effect. It's Evocation, so your friends should be safe. And when you cast it, right when it first appears, and every turn thereafter that the enemy ends their turn in the very massive 30-foot diameter cylinder, and again, that's 60 by 60 total, or 12 by 12 on a grid, right? Huge. They have to make a con save, unfortunately, or take 4d10 radiant damage. It's also Sunlight, which can be very useful against certain monsters. Not only that, but if you are within 60 feet of the cylinder, which should be really easy, considering how you can actually be inside it without taking harm. Thanks, Sculpt Spells. You can move it as a bonus action on your turn. So keeping enemies inside the AoE without hurting your friends or yourself should be fairly easy for us. At level 12, we are a Wizard 10, and we get Empowered Evocation. And this is so good. We can now add our Intelligence modifier to 1 damage roll of any Wizard Evocation spell we cast. And because of the way that, area of effect damage spells work, this is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. When you roll an AoE spell's damage, right, you simply roll the dice once, and every creature in the area of effect takes that much damage, or half on a save, right? So yes, rules as written. This means that we simply get to add 5 flat damage, which is our Intelligence modifier, to each, fireball or lightning bolt or cone of cold that we throw out, and all the monsters take that much, right? You don't roll a different roll for every single monster in the area. Now, what about spells like Dawn? As far as I can tell, when the spell's first cast, it works like other AoE spells, right? Dawn anyway, in that every creature in the area takes the damage, so you'd roll once and add 5 to the damage for every creature. But of course, after that, we shouldn't be adding it. We added it on the initial roll. We get to add it to 1 roll, 1 damage roll, right? And not like subsequent damage rolls on subsequent turns. Also, yes, I am aware of how Empowered Evocation works with Magic Missile. Rules as written and as per Jeremy Crawford, with Magic Missile, you roll 1 die, and then each missile you use, if you upcast the spell, however many missiles you get, they just use that roll of that damage die. And so, in our case, that would be +1 as per the spell, +5 for our Intelligence modifier, for a +6 total to each dart, right? So, yes, if we were to, at this level, cast Magic Missile as a level 5 spell, it would do 1d4 +6 times 7 darts, for an average of 59.5 damage. To a single enemy, no chance to miss or have it resisted unless they have a shield spell. That's pretty nice. It's better even for damage on a single enemy than Animate Objects would be if the enemy is resistant to non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage. But of course, Animate Objects it's a concentration spell, but you get to do that damage every single turn until you lose concentration or the spell ends. So I still probably wouldn't do this personally unless, you're going with a build that's sort of built for it, like by taking, Hexblade levels and things like that. But that's not this build. At level 13, we are a Wizard 11, and we get 6th level spells. Disintegrate, again, as I talked about last week, is amazing for single target damage, 10d6 plus 40. The problem, of course, is if they make their dex save, they don't take half damage, they take no damage, and that's going to feel really bad. And yes, for us, using Magic Missile as a 6th level spell now, if there's a target that just really needs to die and die fast, Magic Missile as a 6th level spell would do almost as much damage as Disintegrate would, 68 damage versus Disintegrate 75 on average. But it's guaranteed to hit, barring, an enemy shield spell or something. So it might be a better option for us on a single target. Probably will be. What I care more about, of course, is Chain Lightning. You target 1 creature within 150 feet, and then lightning will arc from it to up to 3 more targets that are within 30 feet of it. And each of them has to make a dexterity saving throw, or they take 10d8 lightning damage. Of course, if Fireball would hit more targets, or Lightning Bolt for that matter, then you're better off using that, because Chain Lightning will only go up to 4 targets at this level, and it goes up by 1 additional target for every level you upcast it, but the damage doesn't increase, right? So if you can hit, 5 with Fireball, you're going to get more total damage. Chain Lightning is only 6.5 more damage per target on average compared to a 6th level Fireball or Lightning Bolt. Cone of Cold, for that matter, would hit even more, but again, con save. We've gone over that. Damage report, level 13. Now has us throwing out Dawn in round 1 for some decent AoE damage. You're using just a 5th level spell slot here because Dawn does not benefit from being upcast. Then on our burst round, we'd be using Chain Lightning, Action Surge, and throwing out a 5th level Fireball. Both of which benefit by +5 from our empowered evocation, and hitting 3 targets, I'm assuming, again, with those, as well as, damage from Dawn now, which we could move as a bonus action if we needed to. The average dexterity saving throw for a CR 13 monster is only +4. Don't ask me why we're fighting an adult brass dragon, a storm giant, and a beholder all at the same time. 3 CR 13 monsters, but oh well. Damage report against a +0 to saving throw on average. With the above combo, we'd be doing 284 total damage to 3 targets. And against a +4 to saving throws, it would be 249 damage on average. Now, that's a lot of damage, but really we're just talking about 80 damage per target, right? So it's not like if we were actually fighting the dragon, the giant, and the beholder at the same time, we're not going to be one-shotting any of them, right? But if you're actually fighting a group of enemies that's a little more realistic at this level, not just a ton of challenge rating 13 monsters, you might have killed all of them, or most of them, and that's really cool. At level 14, we are a Wizard 12. We get another ability score increase or feat. If you did not take Resilient Wisdom last time, I definitely would here. If you did, I'm not 100% sure that I would go Elemental Adept now. Since we're not necessarily relying so heavily on fire spells like we kind of were earlier in our career, you make the call based on your campaign. Again, on the other hand, you might decide, I'm not going to be upcasting Fireball beyond 3rd or 4th level spell slot. I'm going to, it doesn't scale particularly well. None of these area of effect damage spells scale particularly well compared to enemy hit points. So maybe you say, you know what, I'm gonna go Fireball, Action Surge, Fireball when I'm looking for burst damage, but I'm just gonna keep it at 3rd level, use a 5th level spell for Dawn, and then save my higher level spell slots for, control buff, debuff type stuff, which is, totally valid. Another alternative then, of course, would be to bump your Constitution here. Raise it to a 16, that's gonna help our survivability, obviously, and our concentration checks as well. At level 15, we are a Wizard 13, and we get 7th level spells. There are a lot of amazing 7th level spells. There aren't really any great area of effect 7th level blasting spells, in my opinion. At least not for just pure damage. So I would say take your favorite 7th level spell, whatever you think is going to be the most effective, powerful, useful. If you wanted to use a 7th level spell slot for area of effect damage, and let's be honest, you probably shouldn't in most situations, it would probably be Erupting Earth now, maybe. It has been scaling better with its extra D12 per spell level at this point, so you're doing 7D12 with Erupting Earth. It's bludgeoning damage, and it's a dex save, so that's nice. 2 downsides, however, to Erupting Earth. 1, it's a relatively small area. It's only a 20-foot cube. So, that's 4x4 on the grid is all. It does have the added benefit of making the area difficult terrain, so you get a nice little bit of control in there, potentially. And 2, it's not an evocation spell. So you're probably hitting fewer targets because of the smaller area and the fact that you might need to try and avoid your friends, right? Unless you can bump one of them out of the way with telekinesis or something. So you might still prefer Chain Lightning, Cone of Cold, Fireball here if you're just looking for damage. At level 16, we're a Wizard 14, and we get the Evocation ability Overchannel. This is such a fun ability. When you cast a wizard spell of 1st through 5th level, you can cause it to do maximum damage. And yes, as per good old JC, Jeremy Crawford, this means using a spell slot of 1st through 5th. No, Fireball is a 3rd level spell, so if I upcast it to 7th level, I still get to benefit from Overchannel shenanigans, right? So technically, the highest damage area of effect spell we could use here would be Cone of Cold, which does 8d8 at the 5th level for 64 damage, because it's max damage, right? Compared to either Erupting Earth or Fireball or Lightning Bolt, all of which would do 60 damage, so a 4-point difference is all. If you have Cone of Cold, you decide if you'd rather try your luck against a con save instead of dex, assuming you can hit the same number of enemies, right, with each. Now, with Overchannel, the first time you use it per day, no problem, no negative drawbacks. After that, if you use it a second time, you take 2d12 necrotic damage for each level of the spell that you are overchanneling. And that goes up another d12 every time you use it thereafter in a day. So if we were to use Overchannel a second time in a day on a 5th level spell slot, we would take 10d12 damage, or 65 damage on average. Owie.
Owie. Owie.
Needless to say, unless you've got a healer with a ton of spell slots burning a hole in their pocket, you're not going to be using this more than once per day, very often, if ever. But when you do, it'll be so cool. At level 17, we would be a Wizard 15, and let me issue a word of warning. If you plan on playing this character to level 17 and beyond, and especially if you're going to be starting this character at a higher level, you're going to want to think long and hard about starting with those first 2 fighter levels, right? Because if you had just gone straight Wizard, you would be a Wizard 17 here, you'd be getting 9th level spells, and that means Meteor Swarm, among other things, which does 40d6 of damage in a 40-foot radius sphere. It's the end-all be-all of, area of effect Nova damage spells. A single casting of it out-damages the best we could do right now with Action Surge and 2 high-level spell slots. Not by a lot, actually. It's close. It's very close. Regardless, we've chosen our path. We've enjoyed all of our levels up to this point. No regrets. Maybe you could convince your DM to let you respec, in which case, congratulations. Otherwise, we are content and happy with our 8th level spells that we get at this level. And I actually have a lot to talk about, so bear with me. Abidalzim's Horrid Wilting. As per last episode, we know that this spell has the highest damage numbers for just pure area of effect damage, the dice, right? 12d8. However, it's only 2 damage better than Erupting Earth would be as an 8th level spell slot. It also is not an evocation spell, like Erupting Earth. It requires a con save, so that's probably worse. It does have a 30-foot cube area of effect, so it's bigger than Erupting Earth, but still worse than, Fireball. So that's worth considering. There's some drawbacks, right? There is another spell to consider here for burst damage as well, however, and it is Sunburst. Sunburst is Evocation, so yay. It has a humongous 60-foot radius sphere. So that is a 24 by 24 on a grid, right? And again, because it's Evocation, we could cast it anywhere and probably not hurt anyone that we don't want to hurt. It's 12d6 radiant damage if they fail a con save, unfortunately. Now, 12d6 isn't quite as good, of course, as Abidalzim's for raw numbers, but it also has a fantastic benefit of causing your enemies who fail the save to be blinded, which means that they make attacks at disadvantage and attacks against them would be made with advantage. Considering the massive area, the fact that you can avoid hitting your allies with it, and that it potentially blinds your enemies, I think it's worth giving up the 12 more damage that we'd get from Abidalzim's here almost every time. But you make the call. There's other spells to consider as well. So what about concentration spells? There are a couple new ones to consider here for our concentration. The most famous of which is Illusory Dragon, and for good reason. It's an illusion spell, it requires concentration, and conjures, Trogdor, the Illusory Dragon, to burninate all of the thatched roofed cottages. It occupies the space of a huge creature. It lasts for 1 minute, and when it first appears, any of your enemies who can see it have to make a wisdom save or be frightened for 1 minute. And if it's not, of course, if they're frightened, that means if the dragon is in their line of sight, then they have disadvantage on attacks, and ability checks, and they can't willingly move closer to it, right? They don't get to repeat that saving throw, by the way, at the end of their turn, unless they end their turn in a spot where they don't have line of sight over it. And it's huge, and you can move it. So that seems pretty unlikely. Very nice control and debuff option here with this, as well as some damage, of course. So as a bonus action on our turn, we can move it up to 60 feet, and then anytime while it's moving, make a 60-foot cone breath attack that can be acid, cold, fire, lightning, necrotic, or poison damage, our choice, and it's 7d6 damage. The best part of that is that the enemy has to make an intelligence saving throw to avoid, to take potentially half damage, not dex, right? Which is generally going to be better for us, most enemies, right? The one thing that I really love about this too is if a creature uses its action to succeed on an investigation check against our spell DC, so they have to burn their action just to try and figure out if this is an illusion, right? But if they succeed, they can determine that it's an illusion, but it's not like the illusion dissipates at that point. It just means that now they just have advantage on saves against the breath attack. It's like when you're dreaming, the dream isn't real, but you're still scared. You still wake up and you still can't get it out of your head and you're still afraid of it, right? Except for in this case, because you're still afraid of that dream, it might potentially burn you with acid. It's the worst nightmare ever. There's one other spell to consider for our concentration, Incendiary Cloud. Not an evocation spell, unfortunately, but is the best for just pure numbers from an AoE damage perspective, as I talked about in my sustained damage spell episode, and I probably don't have any cards left to link to it there, so take a drink. Let's see, it's a 20 radius sphere, so same diameter as Fireball. It requires a dexterity saving throw, or the enemy takes 10d8 fire damage, concentration, every turn. One weird thing about Incendiary Cloud and Cloud Kill that's similar to it is, after you cast it, it moves. With Incendiary Cloud, it moves 10 feet directly away from you in a direction that you choose. I wish that we could remove the away from you qualifier there personally. But anyway, for pure damage numbers, this is still theoretically our best option. Again, you have to be careful where you're putting it there, or you're going to hurt your friends too, but worth considering at least. I guess one other one that I'll just make mention of, but I think it's inferior personally, Maddening Darkness. I'm sure some of you are going to mention it in the comments otherwise, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But anyway, it's an evocation spell, yay. It does require concentration. It causes magical darkness, so, dark vision doesn't work. Devil Sight, Tremor Sight, Blind Sense, Blind Fighting, etc., yay, but not regular dark vision, right? In yet another massive 60-foot radius sphere. It doesn't do any damage when you first cast it, unfortunately, but when a creature starts their turn in the darkness, which is filled with shrieks, gibbering, and mad laughter, super creepy, speaking of nightmares, they have to make a wisdom saving throw or take 8d8 psychic damage. Now, your allies would be immune to the damage, of course, because it's an evocation spell, but they wouldn't be immune to the darkness. And while not being able to see an enemy, which would give them disadvantage, and the enemy not being able to see them, which would give them advantage, means that they could potentially just make an attack with as normal there. If them and the enemy are both in darkness. If they were getting advantage via another source, like a barbarian's reckless attack or something like that, they're now not going to be able to have advantage on their attacks, right? And of course, any abilities or spells that require your ally to see someone wouldn't work unless they had Devil Sight or something. So I would just use that with extreme caution. I probably personally would never use it, though. It's a cool and fun spell, and you may disagree, and or you might have a party filled with warlocks that have the Devil Sight invocation. I don't know, but anyway, it's one to consider if it's... Okay, so for the final damage report, I'm going to give you two sets of numbers here, actually. First, sort of that limit of what's possible, and then maybe something a little more conservative and advisable. So, as for what's possible, I'm going to go Incendiary Cloud for my concentration, and then use 2 5th level fireballs using Overchannel on both, and just eating that 65 damage to myself. Crazy, I know. But, maybe you're desperate. Maybe you've got your back up against the wall and there are a ton of healthy enemies bearing down on you. I don't know. In that scenario, assuming you're hitting just 3 targets, against enemies with a +0 to save, you'd be doing a total of 504 damage. And against enemies with a +6 to their dex save, which is the average of a CR 17 monster. Their con save is much worse, so that's why we're going Fireball, not Cone of Cold. Anyway, +6, it's 425 total damage. Now, as far as what's maybe a little closer to what I'd consider doing if I were playing this character more regularly, I think I'd probably go Illusory Dragon for my concentration, just because of the nice, control features and things that you get from it. And then like an Overchanneled Fireball as a 5th level spell, and then maybe a 7th level Erupting Earth spell to give us some nice control, difficult terrain in there for a little more damage too. At that point, damage report, we're talking at a +0 to save, it's still 462 total damage, and against enemies with a +6 to their saving throw, 390. We did have to use an additional spell slot there, a 7th level spell slot instead of a 5th level spell slot, right? But we have also potentially feared our enemies and created a convenient patch of difficult terrain to give us lots of nice control and debuff option. Final thoughts? That was fun. So much damage to so many enemies. I mean, and the truth is, especially at mid-game and beyond, I think it's almost disingenuous to assume that we're only hitting 3 enemies with our spells, right? I'm assuming that on average, if there are more than 3 enemies in the fight, once we get past level 7, more than 3 of them are going to be taking damage in our big barrage. And yes, the total damage you can put out is pretty staggering. Some of the time it might be overkill, right? It might be wasted, and at the very least, might leave you depleted of your most valuable resources. With a lot of enemies still standing, even potentially, depending on what you're fighting. Of course, there's no reason that you would have to blow Action Surge and a second high-level spell. In every single fight, you might throw out Dawn or Melf's Minute Meteors, and then on your next turn, throw out a Fireball or a Chain Lightning, and assess the situation, right? If there are a lot of enemies that are dead, then Action Surge, another Fireball or whatever, probably isn't going to be what you necessarily want to do. Or, on the other hand, as I've kind of mentioned, since Fireball doesn't scale particularly well, maybe you just Fireball, Action Surge, Fireball, but only using 3rd level spell slots, saving your higher level spell slots for things like Wall of Force or Polymorph, etc. in a future fight, or later in this fight if it's really a tough one. Also, we do have to mention there's definitely a drawback to this when compared to other Nova damage builds that I've done, with one exception. Those builds could all put out those numbers once per short rest. And even when their burst round was over, their sustained DPR was pretty good, aside from the Mercy Monk, who was only okay. And again, check out, there's a link in the video description that compares all of the Nova damage builds to each other, right? If you want to look at that. So anyway, for us, we can rain unparalleled destruction down for one glorious round per long rest. And after that, we're a lot more limited, right? If we're using our highest level spell slots for all of that big damage anyway. Of course, we have Arcane Recovery. Action Surge resets on a short rest, so maybe we could do that level of destruction twice per day, but not more than that. And on the other hand, all of those other builds didn't have the ability to potentially clear a room of multiple enemies in a single turn like we do. Or at least seriously soften them up, right? And of course, after our Nova round is done, we are still a wizard with some great battlefield control options, great debuff options, etc. So it's not like we're useless after we've gone through our artillery barrage, right? And man, when you really need to rain fire, no one will be doing it better than you, and it will be so much fun. So that is the show for the week. I love you guys. Thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day. And I hope to see you again really soon. So take care.